now begin the 16th lecture on the books of Samuel. Today we will begin with 2 Samuel chapter 17. The title is Ahithophel and Hushai's Plan. Let's look at the main points. First, Ahithophel gives advice on how to kill David, verses 1 through 4. Second, Hushai tells Ahithophel that his advice is not good, verses 5 through 10. Third, all Israel say that Hushai's advice is good, verses 11 through 14. Fourth, the message is sent through courageous and wise individuals, verses 15 through 20. Fifth, David and all the people cross the Jordan River, verses 21 through 22. Sixth, Ahithophel hangs himself, verse 23. Seventh, Absalom makes Amasa commander, and they cross the Jordan River, verses 24 through 26. Eighth, people who treat David in Mahanaim, verses 27 through 29. Read verse 1. Ahithophel said to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. Verse 2. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I will strike down only the king. After Absalom sat on the throne, he planned to kill his father David. At the time, Ahithophel gave good advice. I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would suddenly attack the people and kill only King David, and I would bring the people back to Absalom. Ahithophel gave precise and wise advice. Ahithophel's advice was precise, as if he had received it from God. Chapter 16, verse 23. Absalom and the elders agreed that his advice was good. However, God later had Ahithophel's plans abolished. Verse 14. In this way, success and failure are in God's hands. Verses 5 through 6. But Absalom said, Summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say. When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. Absalom summoned Hushai, another adviser. Hushai said, The advice Ahithophel has given is not good. King David is a hero and is an experienced fighter, and it will not be good to kill David. King David's men will be as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. There is a chance that Absalom's men will fail because they will be dispirited. Hushai criticized Ahithophel's plans. Hushai gave his own advice to help King David. Hushai gave this advice in order to give King David time to flee. Verse 11. So I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you with you yourself leading them into battle. What was Hushai's advice? Gather all Israel, find and surround David, and destroy all of David's men. Hushai's advice made sense, but it was not good advice. Hushai would make Absalom fail. This advice gave David the chance to escape. The people said that Hushai's advice was better than that of Ahithophel. God frustrated Ahithophel's advice. God worked so that he would bring disaster on Absalom, as it says in verse 14. Verse 15. Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priests, Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I have advised them to do so and so. Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Then they immediately sent word to King David through Jonathan and Ahimaaz. Verse 17. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying at En-Rogel. A servant girl was to go and inform them, and they were to go and tell King David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. Absalom's men heard the news. Absalom's men tried to capture Jonathan and Ahimaaz. Then a servant girl hid them. The girl helped God. Verse 21. After the men had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform King David. They said to him, Set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you. The messengers gave news to King David. Ahithophel advised such and such against you. Hushai gave such advice. You must cross the Jordan River and escape. Verse 23. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. When Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he returned to his hometown. He went to his hometown and he hanged himself. Ahithophel knew that Absalom would be destroyed in the future for not following his advice. In this way, anyone, no matter how wise he may be, will fail if God does not help him. Ahithophel was wise, but he did not have faith. Ahithophel betrayed David. Thus, God punished Ahithophel. Verses 24 through 25. David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Jether, an Israelite who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. King David crossed over the Jordan and went to Mahanaim. Absalom chased after David. Absalom appointed Amasa commander, and he chased after David. Verse 27. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash, from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Makir, son of Amiel, from Lo-debar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rogelim. When David came to Mahanaim, many people helped him. Many people helped him in different ways when David was in danger. Some people risked their lives to deliver messages. Some gave advice like Hushai, and some provided food to eat. Anyone who receives a prophet because he is a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. We will continue with 2 Samuel chapter 18. The title is Absalom's Death. Let's look at the main points. First, David gathers his army and marches out. Verses 1 through 5. Second, Absalom's army loses to David's men. Verses 6 through 8. Third, Absalom's death. Verses 9 through 15. Fourth, Absalom's monument. Verses 16 through 18. Fifth, two men are sent to take news of victory. Verses 19 through 27. Sixth, David hears about Absalom's death and mourns. Verses 28 through 33. Verse 1. David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David gathered soldiers in Mahanaim. He appointed commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. He separated them into 3 groups. Then Joab, Abishai, and Ittai were made commanders. God gave David the opportunity to gather his army. David wanted to go to war with his men. However, David's men said, "You must not go out to war." David's men valued David. Verse 5. The king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." And all the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. When King David sent his army to war, he asked the 3 commanders to be gentle with Absalom. Absalom tried to kill his father. Yet David truly loved Absalom and asked the men not to kill him. Verse 6. The army marched into the field to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. David's army fought with Absalom's army in the forest of Ephraim. 20,000 of Absalom's men died in battle. Many soldiers of Absalom died in the forest. David's army knew well about the geography of the land. Thus, David's army defeated Absalom's army. God helped David's army. Verse 9. Now Absalom happened to meet David's men. he was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in the tree. He was left hanging in mid-air while the mule he was riding kept on going. Absalom rode his mule and went under the thick branches of a large oak. Absalom's head got caught in the branches of the tree. Absalom had a plentiful amount of hair. Chapter 14, verse 26. However, Absalom died because of his hair. Absalom's hair got caught in the branches of an oak tree. Absalom's mule just kept on going. Absalom was left hanging in mid-air. Just then one of Joab's men spoke. The man told Joab what he saw. Joab, the commander, immediately went to Absalom and killed him. Verse 16. Then Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. Joab killed Absalom and sounded the trumpet, and the war ended. Joab threw Absalom's body into a pit in the forest. The men then piled large rocks over him. This was punishment for traitors and rebellious sons. Leviticus chapter 20 verse 9, Deuteronomy chapter 21 verse 18, Joshua chapter 7 verse 26, Joshua chapter 8 verse 29. Absalom also made a monument when he was alive. Absalom lamented because he had no son. In chapter 14 verse 27, Absalom had 3 sons, yet the sons all died. Absalom set up a pillar to comfort himself. This was foolish. We do not gain honor because of a monument. Those who revere and obey God will receive honor from generation to generation. Verse 19. Now Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, "Let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies." David's men sent news of their victory. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said that he would take the news to David. However, Joab did not allow him to. Joab instead sent a Cushite with the news. However, Ahimaaz continued to ask. Ahimaaz asked if he could take the news. He was eventually given permission, and Ahimaaz went behind the Cushite with the news. However, Ahimaaz arrived first. Verse 28. Then Ahimaaz called out to the king, "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king." Ahimaaz gave King David news of their victory. He did not tell David that Absalom was dead. Then the Cushite arrived. Verse 31. Then the Cushite arrived and said, My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has delivered you today from all who rose up against you. The Cushite gave the news. He gave the news that Absalom was dead. King David was very sad. David loved Absalom, and that was good. However, David gave way to his emotions instead of being moved by God's justice, and that was wrong. Absalom did not repent for being a traitor. Then he was destroyed. Thus David cried because he pitied Absalom. It is important that we build up God's justice. We will continue with 2 Samuel chapter 19. The title is King David's Return. Let's look at the main points. First, David's extreme affections for his son, verses 1 through 4. Second, Joab admonishes the king, verses 5 through 8. Third, Israel and the hearts of the men of Judah return to David, verses 9 through 15. Fourth, Shimei and Ziba welcome the king, verses 16 through 17. Fifth, Shimei and Ziba's apology and David's tolerance, verses 18 through 23. Sixth, Mephibosheth's loyalty and David's proceedings, verses 24 through 30. Seventh, Barzillai's welcome and the king's treatment, verses 31 through 39. Eighth, Israel and Judah quarrel over the king, verses 40 through 43. Read verses 1 through 2. Joab was told, The king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And for the whole army the victory that day was turned into mourning, because on that day the troops heard it said, The king is grieving for his son. The soldiers returned with joy after winning the war. However, David mourned for his dead son Absalom. Thus, the soldiers stole into the city like men who were ashamed. David was wrong in overly grieving for his son's death. It was good that David loved his son, but he needed to carry out justice. Absalom rebelled against his father, and he was a traitor to the nation. Therefore, Absalom was to rightfully receive judgment. Verse 5. Then Joab went into the house of the king and said, Today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, and the lives of your wives and concubines. When David mourned over Absalom, Joab went and admonished the king. Why don't you think of the men who gave their lives and were faithful? We have gained victory, and yet we are humiliated. If you do not encourage your men, not a man will be left with you. Verse 8. So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told, the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. Meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes. David listened to Joab, and he collected himself. David sat in the gateway and comforted and encouraged the men. Verse 9. Throughout the tribes of Israel, the people were all arguing with each other, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He is the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled the country because of Absalom." The Israelites now wanted to make David king again. Not too long ago, the Israelites followed Absalom. Now Absalom was dead. Therefore, the Israelites wanted David to return to Jerusalem and make him king again. Verse 11. King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. "Ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters?" King David sent his message to Zadok and Abiathar. David wanted to form a public opinion by asking the elders of Judah, "Let's bring the king back to his palace." Verse 13. "And say to Amasa, 'Are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if from now on you are not the commander of my army in place of Joab.'" Amasa was Absalom's commander of the army. He betrayed David. Chapter 17, verse 25. Still, David said that he would approve of Amasa if he returned. David wanted to appoint Amasa to win over all the Israelites. Verse 16. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. The people heard that David was returning to Jerusalem. Shimei welcomed David. Shimei cursed David when David escaped from Absalom. Chapter 16, verse 5. Yet Shimei welcomed David at this time. Next, Ziba welcomed David. Ziba was Saul's servant. He slandered Mephibosheth and intercepted his inheritance. Chapter 16, verse 1. David's men then said, "Let's kill Shimei." In verse 21, Abishai said that Shimei should be put to death for cursing the king. However, David forgave Shimei. David pardoned Shimei for his sin. Then David deferred Shimei's punishment. Later, King Solomon killed Shimei. 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 8. Verse 24. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet, or trimmed his mustache, or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned safely. Jonathan's son Mephibosheth came to meet David. Mephibosheth had not trimmed his mustache. He remained confined until David returned. He took part in David's suffering. In verse 27, Mephibosheth said that Ziba slandered him. Ziba slandered Mephibosheth before David. In verse 29, David told Mephibosheth to divide the fields with Ziba. However, Mephibosheth said, "I do not need the field." Mephibosheth was satisfied with dining before the king. Mephibosheth was thankful that David returned to his palace. Mephibosheth was not greedy. Verse 31. Barzillai the Gileadite also came down from Rogelim to cross the Jordan with the king and to send him on his way from there. Barzillai helped King David. David said to Barzillai, "Let's go to Jerusalem." David wanted to repay him for his grace. Barzillai rejected his offer. Instead, in verse 37, he asked David to take his servant Kimham. Kimham was most likely Barzillai's son. David was thankful for Barzillai's kindness. Verse 40. When the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed with him. All the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. The people of Judah welcomed David when he returned to the palace. The Israelites also welcomed David. The people of Judah were always on David's side. The Israelites, however, followed Absalom and then later returned to King David. The people of Judah were more loyal. We will continue with 2 Samuel chapter 20. The title is Sheba's Rebellion. Let's look at the main points. First, Sheba rebels, verses 1 through 2. Second, David confines his concubines in a house, verse 3. Third, the king tells Amasa to summon the men of Judah, verses 4 through 5. Fourth, the king orders Abishai to pursue Sheba, verses 6 through 7. Fifth, Joab kills Amasa, verses 8 through 13. Sixth, Joab begins to tear down the wall of Abel, verses 14 through 15. Seventh, one woman's wisdom saves Abel, verses 16 through 22. Eighth, duties given to David's royal family, verses 23 through 26. Read verse 1. Now a troublemaker named Sheba, son of Bichri, a Benjamite, happened to be there. He sounded the trumpet and shouted, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son. Every man to his tent, O Israel." Sheba, a Benjamite, led a rebellion. The Israelites then began to take part in Sheba's rebellion. Verse 3. When David returned to his palace in Jerusalem, he took the 10 concubines he had left to take care of the palace and put them in a house under guard. He provided for them, but did not lie with them. They were kept in confinement till the day of their death, living as widows. David's concubines lied with Absalom before all of Israel. Thus David confined them to a house under guard. Leviticus chapter 20 verse 11, Deuteronomy chapter 22 verses 25 through 27. Verse 4, Then the king said to Amasa, Summon the men of Judah to come to me within 3 days, and be here yourself. David made Amasa commander. Amasa went to summon the men of Judah. However, Amasa took longer than the time David set for him. This was harmful to the nation. Thus King David ordered Abishai to pursue Sheba. Verse 8, While they were at the great rock in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Joab was wearing his military tunic, and strapped over it at his waist was a belt with a dagger in its sheath. As he stepped forward, it dropped out of his sheath. Joab killed Amasa. Joab was wrong in doing this. Joab killed Absalom in the past. Joab then killed Amasa as a result of jealousy and resentment. Chapter 19, verse 13. 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. Amasa's death affected and brought harm to Israel. David welcomed Amasa and wanted to use him for the nation of Israel. Verse 14. Sheba passed through all the tribes of Israel to Abel Beth Maachah, and through the entire region of the Berites, who gathered together and followed him. Sheba entered the city of Abel. There was a wise woman there. Joab was about to break down the city walls. Then the wise woman came and convinced the people of the city to cut off the head of Sheba and throw it to Joab. Joab ultimately defeated Sheba. Sheba's rebellion came to an end. Verse 23. Joab was over Israel's entire army. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites. David entrusted important duties to his men. David granted duties to each man according to their gifts and abilities. We too must appoint people with faith, ability, and talents. We must bring up the church well. Here we will conclude the 16th lecture on the books of Samuel. Thank you.